We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland off today. Joining me now, Astead Herndon, national politics reporter at the New York Times, host of the Run Up podcast. Astead, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
I should say I wasn't headed in the best of places. I was actually heading to my mom's funeral, but I listened to the that episode of The Daily, the day after the election that you were on. I guess that you recorded it like at 2 a.m. It was, I mean, the whole thing was, obviously the whole thing was a little bit depressing for me, but also depressing for the country. I want to just turn to that in a little bit because you're giving some assessments there. And it felt like you were not super shocked with the outcome of the election, and part of that, you did an episode of the Run Up on I guess it was the next day, Thursday the 7th, where you basically just talked about this interview or ran it that you had done with a woman earlier in the year, and that sort of summed up stuff from your perspective. Just give us a sense of what your reporting has been over the past couple of years or so, just so that we get a context for that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you listening and having me on. I mean, so much of our work over the last couple years was based on a pretty basic premise, which is that after the midterms, I kind of saw two parties headed toward nominating deeply unpopular nominees. And so a lot of our work has been dealing and talking to a country that was wrestling with that over the scope of that time. And one of the things that was really clear to us really early was that the Democratic Party didn't realize how much they were a part of that equation. They thought it was just Donald Trump who was unpopular. They thought it was just Donald Trump who people were shocked was returning. And that was definitely true. We heard so much about January 6th, legal cases. How can this guy be coming back? Blah, blah, blah. But right after that was, holy shit, Joe Biden is running for reelection too.
Right.
And for a couple years, it was just so palpable how they did not see themselves as an equal part of what people were feeling in terms of political systems brokenness. And so when the result came in, it's not necessarily like I knew Donald Trump was going to win. But I knew that Joe Biden's unpopularity and the Democratic Party's unpopularity was a fundamental fact of this race. And it was just a fact they never dealt with. And so whether it was the year and a half of him running, whether it was Harris's refusal to break with Biden, it always felt to me like they were trying to win a race without doing the obvious thing because it was a change moment and they weren't really speaking to that. So they were basically relying on the country thinking Donald Trump was completely unacceptable. And so that's what the race for me ended up looking like, was this Trump versus anti-Trump thing that they were doing. But it's not like that really spoke to folks' most biggest concerns. And so because we were doing this kind of 2-year effort of focusing on the electorate in the pockets of the people in the country who are going to decide the race, we were there for a long time. And so what you heard that night was really me feeling like it would be a disservice to the reporting to pretend like this is just a question of Donald Trump winning.
Right.
It was also a story to me of Democrats losing. And I just didn't feel as if that story had gotten enough attention. And it's a shock to me that it took the result for that, because the data and the evidence for a long time was pointing to the possibility of that result.
Okay. And so, and it really comes, I mean, the election, the outcome was not one thing, but this is definitely like the idea of like it being a double hater election. I think ran deeper than people assumed.
Yeah.
And, just marginally, one person was maybe hate is even the wrong word, because or not. Well, let's go back a little bit though, because what was it in your sense? And going back 2 years may not even provide the answers for this question, but I'm curious as to what your perspective is on it. Like the hating of Donald Trump, I think, people have a pretty good sense of what that was about, right? Like, it could be January 6th for some people. It could be grab him by the P word. I mean, there could be a whole series. He could be a pathological liar. I mean, like there's a lot of reasons. It's at least within the context of this audience, I think it's pretty obvious. What was the genesis from your perspective? And maybe you didn't come across this because it was maybe already baked into the cake by the time that you started reporting on it. What was the genesis of the hatred of Biden? And I mean, the weird
and Democrats broadly,
Democrats broadly, although they overperformed that in the, in terms of the Senate.
I don't think it's universal. I think it was really a top of the ticket problem for Democrats. And really, if to answer the question, I think it comes back to a break of trust that Biden did with the rest of the public. It was a misread of the 2020 mandate. What we were encountering was people who over and over felt like they had pulled an emergency lever for Joe Biden, that they had used the kind of temporary solution. And then for a lot of people, they tuned out of politics come 2021 through like 2023-ish. And they look up and the man is running again in a way that they did not recognize. So much of our work in 2023, we were going around the country and people would ask, like, some people wouldn't even know who was running. And so I had this, it used to be this very consistent thing where I'd be like, yeah, it's going to be Biden, Trump again. And the look of shock on people's faces is something I would never forget, right? Like, so many people felt as if they had this implicit agreement with Biden that he was either going to run for one term or pass the torch or bridge generation or whatever you want to call it. And I also just think that you couple that with the realities of inflation that people did not think the Democrats were speaking to. And I also feel like the big benefit of not holding the big benefit is not the word. The big problem with not holding the primary is that they didn't get to recalibrate the Democratic message from the times in which I think people most remember it from 2019, 2020. And so, I do think the kind of wokeness brand has lasted longer than there's even reality, because most Democrats don't even talk like that right now. It's just that I think the last time they were having a macro party conversation, it was led by a kind of nonprofit, academic-y progressive universe that, to be honest, a lot of people don't think is speaking to their most material concerns. And so you had to. So
if I can understand what you're saying there, because, I've heard the argument, which I think is legitimate, that the lack of a primary, and I'm not talking about like a 3-week super primary, whatever.
Yeah, I'm talking about 20. I'm early.
A full-on actual primary. I've heard the argument that the lack of the primary did not allow for a candidate to come out and understand where the electorate was and get a sense of that. But what you're saying is on the receiving end, a lack of a primary inhibited the ability of the electorate to move past to where the Democrats were today.
Absolutely. Because I don't think it's just a question of like the politicians learning where their electorate was, which would have been true. I actually think Democrats have shifted a bunch in the last 4 years. So let's take, for example, the way that Harris was blamed for individual flip-flops on her positions. A lot of those things are reflective of the Democratic Party switching positions from 4 years ago to now. They've gone to the center on immigration, right? Like they've shifted where they were. They don't use Latinx and all of that type of stuff anymore. They're not as actually like focused on specific identity markers as I think they were 4 years ago. I just don't think they actually had a chance to tell the country that or to recalibrate kind of where they were. And so honestly, I think the Republican ads about she's for they, them, not you hit different because Democrats have not actually, they didn't have a story to tell folks that I think was updated to actually where they are. And
Because-
so, yeah. And so I just think that like they ceded so much ground by tying themselves just to Joe Biden, the incumbency in the administration, that it blew my mind at the time. And
Well-
I just think it was this like insider discussion where they made a decision amongst themselves that, you know, that the policies would translate, that Donald Trump was inherently unacceptable. All of those stories, I just think were things that they had a kind of internal agreement on and ends up putting them in this position.
That's fascinating because, I mean, and it makes sense. I mean, because when we're talking about the election now, we're talking about 10% of the people that come out to vote. Like, you know, on both sides, it's almost like taken for granted. But there's a percentage of people, it sounds like you're saying, are basically, we're sort of like politically Rip Van Winkled. And they went to sleep in, you know, the moment that Biden gets elected, and they come back just in terms of.
They basically came back on that first debate.
And they came back in that first debate, and we're like, wait, what's going on? I can't believe this guy's still the candidate. And
100%, but that's how most people ingest politics. That's how the 10% of people we're talking about, the folks who decide elections, that's mostly how they engage in this. And so it was just so wild to me that
and also what's missed at that point is that everything that Biden has done in terms of a labor situation, everything that's happened in terms of like, you know, I don't know how deep into antitrust people would be, but it would get communicated to them through some type of like anti-corporate narrative that they didn't hear because the last thing they heard was like, we're shutting down for COVID.
Yeah.
How much and then I want to turn to the story of Monica because it's fascinating to me. And I have to say that like my perspective changed in a way through this that I became a little bit more skeptical of her towards the end, oddly enough.
Sure.
But tell us about Monica and why she was the person that you chose to sort of like
to highlight,
illustrate, to illustrate, you know, she's the microcosm, or I guess that explains the macro.
Yeah, we chose her basically because she was a double hater. I think that, you know, we met so many people on the road, and I wanted to find someone that was in a swing state, torn legitimately between options, and felt like they were swimming through the journey of this election as we were. So we had met her a couple times. I originally met her at an RFK Jr. event where she was there for a comedy show he was throwing in suburban Michigan. And
who was the comedians on that bill? If I could just ask.
But the guy from Deuce Bigelow, what's his name? Rob
Schneider.
Yes.
Oh, God.
Yes, Rob Schneider was the main.
That I think it's. I should say, like, it's a lot more telling than I think. You know, that it's 100%. Rob Schneider.
Well, one thing I would say is like, even doing some of the RFK stuff, he was on a double hater pause. Like, I think he was a ridiculous vessel for that pause, but he understood that a lot of people were swimming through a distaste of two parties and a choice between two options they didn't want.
Right.
And that was the whole frame of the event. And so there was all these people, some of whom were not sure they were going to vote for him, but were there and kind of wrestling with their options, whatever. And so we originally met her there. And she had,
and how old is she? Can you give us just like her?
Yeah, she's like a 40-something-year-old woman. She's single, and she works in the auto industry in Michigan. Of course, a very popular thing. And her job recently got eliminated, and she is blaming these EV mandates for that, which is a huge topic, obviously, in Michigan. We hear about it all the time. And so she has some kind of specific things to her. But the biggest thing that we thought was true of the macro situation was that she was wrestling with her options and didn't like her options. So RFK drops out. She wasn't sure she was going to vote for him anyway. And RFK drops out. We follow up with her after the RFK thing once he drops out. And she said that she had gone to both a Harris and she had gone to a Biden and a Trump event. And she felt that at the Trump event, she felt a sort of like authoritarian energy she didn't like.
She
But
described it as Reiki.
She described it as Reiki, yes. And then, but she also said that she felt that like she didn't get enough specifics from Democrats. And I know that people feel like those things are not one-to-one. And I get that. And those were the questions, obviously, I asked her.
Right. Nazi vagueness.
Yes, 100%.
Right.
Like I that's the reason we posed the questions to her. But all I would say is that is not an atypical type of thing that we hear. We hear a lot of people kind of struggle with their dislike of Donald Trump and their dislike of Democrats. And I would just add that, like, I think there is some sense, you know, particularly I think for like a Times liberally style audience, we used to get a lot of these emails that would say these people are just inevitable Trump voters. Like they were just always going to go to him in the end. And I don't really think that's true. Like for the most of the undecideds, the independents, the whatever you want to call them, they were both real in a way that people I think were trying to talk over, but they also don't like Donald Trump. They really don't. And so like, yes, they do not find him disqualifying, which I think is the big difference is like, they don't find January 6th inherently disqualifying or what he tweets or what he says or whatever, but they were looking for a way out. And one of the things that she expressed in that interview is she would have felt more comfortable with the Democrat that she had felt going through a sense of the process. And I really believe that. We heard from even Democrats who said that they felt like the party hadn't put them in the best position to win this race because they didn't like how the last 2-3 years had developed. And so I do think a lot of the penalty that like the kind of undecideds end up holding against the party is about that type of process. It's about the assumption that Donald Trump will be unacceptable so we can give you what they interpret as basically anything. And I think that starts with Joe Biden and then reflects on Kamala Harris.
I mean, there were a couple of things that really stuck out at me, and almost like sort of working backwards. I mean, first off, let me ask you this: like, did you ever ask her about unions? Because I mean, here's a former auto worker, and I wonder, like, you know.
We actually asked, she was in the UAW, and we asked Sean Fain about her. Like, we literally talked to her union president about Monica, because there was the second time we talked to her, we asked her specifically about unions. And she was, I mean, and you kind of hear this in the kind of rank and file union folks sometimes. She was basically saying that she disagreed with her union leadership, who had supported Democrats because she felt that and this was the EV mandate specific part, she felt that had hurt her individual plan, and that's what she was holding against them. And so when we ended up talking to Sean Fain at the Democratic National Convention, and I was like, hey, I just talked to this lady Monica who's in your union, and whatever. And he gave her a specific message. They followed up with her. Like, all I'm saying is, like, it's interesting to me just because it's a type of person who has so many markers that could lead them to Democrats.
Right.
And she kind of rejected them along the way. And I don't think that is, I don't think that's true for all of those kind of folks who decided late, but that's why I thought she was the right person to ask, because she had actually thought through why she had rejected unions, why like Reiki wasn't enough, right? Like why she cares about abortion rights all the time. We talked about her at the beginning, why that wasn't enough to vote for Kamala Harris.
Well, there one of the things that stuck out for me is that I mean, of the many, was one, she talked about Harris flip-flopping. Yeah. Which you know, you addressed in the sense that, like, maybe had there been a longer primary process, it would have seemed more like an evolution, because it's 4 years later. I will also say that, like, it's not a completely baseless assertion that Harris never had any type of like internal compass in terms of politics, both because she never formed any, like, you know, she was a prosecutor. Yeah. that doesn't, that there's really no, I mean, there's arguably an ideology there, but it's not like one that is articulated in the way that people, it's, you know, you're more of like a bureaucrat on some level from people's perspective. As a senator, she wasn't in there for very long and hadn't really established her bona fides. And frankly, I remember her questioning Joe Biden and saying, you know, like, where were you in terms of busing? And then 3 days later, it was like, on the other hand, maybe it's not that big of a deal. And so she was susceptible to that, but that's a high sensitivity. The other thing that Monica said that also struck me was, because I don't have any brothers or sisters, because I'm 37 and I don't have any kids, I don't have to worry about the future. And it sounds callous. I'm quoting her, and it sounds shallow and self-interested. But the point of the matter is, if I can't take care of myself and pay my own bills immediately, I can't dedicate my personal time outside of work to work with people in recovery.
The owning of the selfishness.
Addict. I mean, but it was also like in the context of her recovery, there's like some awareness of like, I have to feed myself and protect my peace, I guess, and go forward, whatever it is. Those things really, really struck me. But I also have to say, like, her staying in the game with Joe Biden, because even after the debate, she was still sort of like,
she was still,
that to me makes me feel like, and you know, it's just simply like, if it's the case, it's the fact that like she has a bias towards against maybe it's a female. I suspect it's a female candidate, because I mean, Joe Biden was barely Senate. And there is a lot of things that Harris did wrong, in my estimation, and, you know, left on the table. But the idea that just like substituting out a generic Democrat, I feel like if, you know, Martin O'Malley was there, she would have been like, okay, you know, it's just. I mean, did you get that sense?
I think you're right, and I think that comes up in a lot of our talks with folks all the time. Like, I can lay out kind of broader and, you know, kind of structural reasons why people are why they're voting the way that they are. But so many of the things that come up are those kind of individual preferences, which fall on the same type of racist, sexist, whatever markers you want to land. And so I am not someone who says that those things don't matter. They absolutely matter. I remember back in 2019-20, when I would run into people who were torn between Bernie and Bloomberg, and I would be like, what is the through line? And the real through line is they just liked a white guy who felt strong, you know? And so many of people's individual voting decisions come down to those preferences. And I think that Harris, certainly the flip-flopping thing hurt her uniquely because of who she is. And as someone who covered her initial presidential race, I may have written more about her kind of political shortcomings or maybe lack of vision than like anyone else in mainstream media. And I still don't think that explains a lot of the ways that folks come to her. And so I definitely don't kind of demean that. The only thing I would say is when we think about the ways that like racism, sexism impact this race, I don't just start with, you know, how the Monicas ended up voting. What big way I think it impacted this race is the Biden White House did not set her up in a position to be the leader of the party, and when I was reporting a profile of Kamala Harris last year and asking, is there any different ways that you treated this number two because she's a Black woman and the first person to hold that position? No. They were still talking about, well, we did it like this with Al Gore, or we did it like this when Joe Biden was the number two. And it was a complete dismissal. She was not selected with the idea of the future in mind. She was not set up with the fact that she could be the future leader of the party. And that kind of shelving, I think, is also a racism, sexism impact too. So I just think
in terms of like the motivation behind it, but the complete
A misread of their mandate. Yeah.
Yes,
100%.
obliviousness, a misread to their mandate, and an obliviousness to, like, you'd have to, you'd have to be completely blinkered to not think that there is a automatic,
Sure.
minus 2 points for a black woman running. I don't know what
And
the
I'm
number
like,
is,
these are
but
all
it's-
these Democratic liberals who spend all their time on the trail talking about the white supremacy and racism, sexism, and they don't even operate with that in mind. And so
right.
all
They're
I'm
not
saying,
doing anything to sort of say, like, okay, at one point,
right,
Joe Biden's not going to live forever,
100%.
and she's going to have to run. And, like, what are we doing?
What are we doing?
What are we doing to make her see? To sort of like put her in a position to succeed.
Let me tell you a specific example on this point. There was I was reporting the profile on the vice president last year, and I remember seeing some stat that said, the vice president's kind of people, a circle, showed me some stat that was like, when she delivers the Biden message in some focus groups, like people move, just trying to show her as an effective messenger. Very kind of baseline politics stuff. And I remember someone in the White House telling me, well, that's true for everybody because our message is a good one. And I say that to say, there wasn't a sense of like, oh yes, she's on our team. This is a ticket. We selected her for that reason. She is an effective communicator of the message. It was like, Joe Biden is the president. He is doing a good job. And anyone who says that shows some, anyone who says that, it lands with public. And it was a demeaning of her specifically that I found as reflective of their own kind of self-belief, that they had cocooned themselves in this type of bubble where it could only be Joe. And that it itself, it was so disconnected from the public that that's why the reasons I go back to why they lost this race start 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Because I remember, telling them, on the podcast, we hear about age of Gaza a ton or whatever. And these Biden folks would, they would sit back from the table and they say, Donald Trump is on the other side and democracy's on the line. And you're talking about age? And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly why I'm talking about it. It's because everyone else is. And so that's the tone in which they were coming to this with. So much so that I think it impacted how the crisis that eventually brings them to her, it didn't have to be like that. And so that's what I think is the big impact of what I hope is the lasting impact of the work that we did over the last couple of years is just that they made choices, and they made choices over the evidence and over people like me asking them. And I don't think they should get away with saying that no one saw it coming or no one saw the possibility of this result. A lot of people did. They ignored them.
Yeah. I mean, and what's interesting too, is I think, for me, the Clinton loss, there was, let's say, a half a dozen but-fors.
Yeah.
But in this one, it feels like there were a half a dozen things that had to aggregate for this to happen. And, and Biden's hubris and arrogance. I mean, this is who this guy is, and it seems to have bled down to everything. And I think but I would also go back to even like, because it's interesting. So much of this is not sort of policy based with these people. The policies give maybe sort of like a broader narrative, which they could have like hung a campaign on, but it was inhibited by a lot of this other stuff, I think. But what strikes me as interesting is when you were talking about abortion on the on the night of the election, I guess, or in the morning the next day, and people have mentioned consistently that Donald Trump is different than other Republicans on abortion rights, and I've heard that. And one of the problems that I think was set up, and I've argued it was like in the wake of the American Rescue Act, was Biden reverting back to 1993, essentially, inviting the Republicans in to negotiate Build Back Better. They couldn't come up with anything. So inviting Portman and Sinema in, and this whole notion of like, you making Donald Trump distinct from the Republican Party and the Republican Party distinct from Donald Trump, it ends up benefiting Donald Trump because nobody believes him anyways.
Yeah.
And so he's untethered and can say to Muslims and Arab Americans in Michigan, I'm on your side. And to, you know, right-wing Jews in Pennsylvania, I'm on your side.
Yeah.
And
they both
like,
end up voting for him.
and they both end up voting for him. And because there was such a reluctance to tie Donald Trump to the Republican Party and anchor him here and say like, okay, he may be a vassal, he may be a flip-flopper, but they're not. And the whole Lynn Cheney, that's not only did it not get him anything, that mode of thinking prevented them from basically tying Trump to any set of policy issues that were meaningful to anybody.
Yeah, it's a strategy that flopped. You know, it's just not like even every kind of leg of it. And I think Democrats told themselves a story after the midterms because Biden really did succeed. And I think Democrats succeeded in framing those candidates as outside the Republican norm, particularly in battleground states. I think that they just took that strategy nationally. And one of the things that people people do not think Donald Trump, like people project what they want onto Donald Trump. And so he's not Carrie Lake, you know, he's not Doug Mastriano. He's someone who people think they know better than what you're telling them. And so a lot of folks, you know, specifically, you know, when I mentioned abortion rights, like I think there was a sense that, you know, you frame him and the rest of the party is anti-abortion, he will be punished for anti-abortion. And we were talking to women in Arizona who plan to vote for the abortion rights referendum and Donald Trump. And they were like, well, yeah, he says he's not going to do a ban. Like, that's the one thing I know about him. And so for as much as he's a flip-flopper, I think there's a couple times that we have to acknowledge his consistency on a couple of things. One of which is immigration. I think the biggest one is, like, for as much as, you know, he has changed policy positions left and right on so many issues, the country is closer to him on immigration now than they were in 2016, you know, and he's been there the whole time. And so when Democrats basically concede the problem of the border and just say, we're the better framers of the solution, I always thought that was a fairly risky thing to do.
Right.
Because if you think the border is a problem, aren't you voting for Donald Trump?
Right.
Like, if you think the border is the biggest issue, like
100%.
You're going to vote for the person who has been saying that for 8 years straight.
100%.
And so, like, I just think that there was some, you know, I said this on the Daily once before, but there's some ways that, like, I think national or like top level Democrats think they're in debate class. And the only thing that matters is being right. And I'm like, yeah, he killed the immigration bill. They're totally right about that. Like, whatever. But that's not actually how most people go about who they decide they're going to vote for. Like, if they think that that immigration is a big problem, they're probably going to vote for the person who has told them for the longest time in the loudest possible voice that immigration is a problem. Well, and that is completely distinct from who provided the solution or who killed the bill in Congress or whatever it is. And so you can win the actual debate, as she did. Like, no one even Trump voters say that Kamala Harris won that debate, you know, like, but that's not actually the fullest point. And, you know, they just fundamentally did not understand this was a change election. Just did not get that people were upset with the status quo.
And they don't understand, I think, the dynamic that you're talking about is that, like, he was there first. It's their issue. I mean, aside from sort of like the moral implications and sort of like the practical implications and all of the real things, what's amazing to me is that, you know, Barack Obama won Iowa in 2008, in my estimation, by being the first person to talk about Social Security in crisis. Social Security was not in crisis and I don't even think he provided a solution, although later he was talking, when he got into office about cutting cost of living increases for seniors on some level. But by bringing it up, it just meant like, oh, he's the one who's talking about Social Security, even if he's talking about it incorrectly, like that's his now. He owns that. You can't outflank him unless you say it's a bigger problem because I'm not going to go and read the bill that would have resolved all of immigration. And so I have a choice. I'm either going to have to spend the next 2 weeks reading this and making the decision, or just going with the guy who's been screaming about it the most.
Right. And so I guess there was some level of it where I was like, oh, this rightward turn, the only way it works is when when you really believe that the folks are basing their votes on who's the solution and you're going to beat them on the solution. But that's not really how folks operate. And so I just think that that's why I talk about debate class is I just think that there was a sense of haughtiness, a kind of academic, oh, well, we've laid out this, and this. So of course folks are going to come to us from that lens. And I'm like, have you actually met the people who decide our elections? I remember talking to this guy who was undecided between Harris and Trump in Minnesota. And I was like, well, how will you choose? What's it going to come down to? And he's like, well, I'll drive to the polls on election day, and whichever one of these issues matters more to me. I kind of agree with Trump on immigration, economy. I kind of agree with Harris on abortion rights and that Trump is crazy. But we'll see on the day which one of those matters more. And that's how most people go. That's how the folks go about it. It's not that deep. And so I'm like, there has to be a recognition of who people are, and you operate in that mind. One thing about the Biden premise from the start, it was so reliant. They took as a fact how people were disinterested in this election and only going to come to it in the last week. And I was like, your actions are adding to the disinterest. Right. From 2 years ago, they were like, well, no one's caring about politics. And so it'll matter once Donald Trump is crazy in the last week or so, and people will be scared by him. And I'm like, you're risking the House on the last week.
And on his behavior.
Yeah, on his behavior.
You've just taken it completely out of your own hands.
And they were so sure of that. And I was like, isn't this a little risky at the minimum? And they were, and I guess I'm like, they were not only saying no, they were acting like you were crazy for saying the thing was risky.
The arrogance is impressive. All right, so let me ask you this. With all of this said, and in my internal clock, I'm like, and also just having been through, I was doing this in 2004. I was doing it in 2016.
Yep.
And the postmortems.
Yeah.
Right. A two-part question. Is there anything we can actually learn from this from a ideological or a policy standpoint? Or is this just if you've got a bunch of people who are a little bit arrogant, watch out, try and make sure your politicians are not this arrogant. And B, is any of this based upon that? When the guy just shows up, at the poll and says I'm going to, is it even going to be relevant? These postmortems that we're doing now, is this going to be relevant even 2 years from now? I mean, 4 years from now, who knows what this country is going to be looking like and what
Sure.
I mean, in the past 12 days, Bobby Kennedy is going to basically polio for everybody. And Matt Gaetz, who knows what, is any of this going to matter?
I think that's a great question because I'm not sure. I don't think the postmortems that are ideological based are that, to me, having been up close for the last couple of years, I don't think the lesson for me with Democrats is they should have been more left or they should have been more right. I think they should have been more responsive to the public. They should have processes that include the public's concern and and don't insulate themselves from that. There was nothing stopping them from recognizing 2 years ago that the majority of their base wanted a different nominee. That was true in every piece of data. That was true in every poll. That was true when you taxed people on the ground. Like, the only thing that stopped them was they didn't care. And so, like, I actually think that, to me, the biggest lesson is not that they, there was some big working class realignment that they couldn't have spoken to. I think they just blocked people out who were expressing that. And so I'm like, I feel like, to me, the biggest shift they could make is some form. I think it's a party problem that has to, in the ways that Republicans, we were in the 2020, we went to the winter meetings of both parties right after the midterms. And this is the critical window, in my opinion, of when this shit went left, is a year and a half ago, when the Republicans were embarrassed by the midterms and had a pretty open discussion about what they had to do in 2024. That included the Trump wing saying, yeah, we got to chill out on saying early voting and is bad. That included the kind of standard Republicans telling them stop talking about the 2020 steal and start talking about Joe Biden's unpopularity. Like, these were all things they were fairly talking. We went a week later to the Democrats, and they were saying the lesson of the midterms is that we are doing A-okay. That we are doing that in the same way that the folks found those Senate candidates unacceptable, they will find Donald Trump unacceptable in the year and a half. And so the things that you're bringing up, little New York Times reporter, about Joe Biden's unpopularity or about his age or about all of that stuff, all of that will not matter. And they were in the process of moving South Carolina to the front of the primary, not only to make it easier for Joe Biden. They were in the middle of telling people they did not need debates in the primary or canceling some of the state primaries to make it easier for Biden's reclaiming of the nomination. And so that lack of responsiveness, Republicans work from the premise of supporting and appeasing their base and making the rest of the people, be it the Nikki Haley's of the world or who else, go along with it. Democrats don't work from that premise. They work from appeasing the others and making their base go along with it.
Right.
And I just think that instinct from them has been found out in these really important elections. And I just don't think that, and so to me, that's the biggest postmortem, is how do they create a process, or how do they install people, or how do they have a party that actually listens and responds? Because more than an individual policy, I think that was what I saw over the last couple of years. They did not care about any input of evidence that was not what they believed.
The whole Dianne Feinstein thing
For sure.
is in many ways like a perfect illustration of what the dynamic was, and we just got it again with this. I mean, at the end of the day, I think it really comes down to could they have convinced Jill Biden to basically say, that Joe? But if everybody had agreed early on, these party apparatchik, we're just not going to go along with it. It's going to be humiliating.
But they were there before the midterms. I remember the summer of 2022 when a whole bunch of people were talking about how Joe Biden's unpopular, about how they're in the trouble for 2024, all of that type of stuff. And then they got after, and they move with the level of self-preservation that matches what their ambitions are going forward. And I'm like, you all were telling me last summer that you saw all these signs, right?
I mean,
and
maybe 2022 should have been had 2022 been more of a thrashing for Democrats,
right?
The
beating of their own expectations, which were imposed by themselves, right? Like they lost the House, right? The red wave just didn't come to fruition, and so I'm like, there was enough evidence to say that the country, Republicans won the popular vote in the midterms, right? Like, it wasn't actually a problem of the evidence. So I guess I'm on this I'm beating this horse about political insiders, because I feel like what I have learned is the closer you get to the decisions, just the further they are from the public service aspect of the job. And so that to me feels like the core lesson is if you make decisions removed from public, at some point, that's going to catch up to you. Like, this is still a thing that is driven from the bottom up, no matter how much the top down wants to say it is. Like, they have been wrong in these elections from 2016 on, because there is a grassroots thing happening in America and the upsetness with political systems and how they are. And if they don't want to speak to that, they're going to get punished. And they have been.
Astead Herndon, national politics reporter at the New York Times, host of the Run Up podcast. We'll put a link to that in the podcast YouTube description. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thank you for your work. I love it.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.